The Millionaire's 6-year-old twins didn't speak until the new cleaning lady arrived and did what no nanny had ever done. Before we begin, leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story? You're hired, but you must not get involved with my children beyond what's necessary. Your job here is to clean, nothing else. Those words still echoed in Ruby Gonzalez's mind as she scrubbed the living room floor with a mop that looked like it had survived a medieval battle. She paused for a moment, glanced at her reflection in the marble, adjusted her hot pink jumpsuit, looking like the Pink Panther, and slid on her knees as if she were surfing. Wow. 3 points for Ruby in artistic cleaning, she said, lifting the mop like a trophy. Ruby began humming softly, inventing her own tune. Dirt go away, stress be gone, I came to shake up this floor. But she didn't know she was being watched. At the door, 2 little eyes peeked out in silence. Ollie and Liam, 6 years old, identical twins, quiet, serious, stuck in time since the day they lost their mother. Ruby's song grew more lively. She spun dramatically with the mop, bumped the bucket by accident, and sent a rag flying like a dove of peace, landing right on the face of a marble bust. Oops, sorry, Mr. Statue. Hope you don't sue. And then it happened. A giggle, then another. Soft, shy, but real. Ruby stopped, looked at the door. Nobody. Am I hearing little ghosts, or did this house finally find something funny? Upstairs in his office, Edward Royce, billionaire CEO, widower, master of coldness, and official distributor of dry orders, watched everything on the cameras. The dance, the choreographed disaster, the unplanned mess, and the smiles he hadn't seen in 2 years. One corner of his mouth twitched, slowly, and then, against all odds, he laughed, quiet, brief, but enough to startle himself. The next day Ruby showed up earlier, this time with a new accessory, a tape measure hanging around her neck. Nobody knew if it was part of her costume or if she thought she could measure the negative energy in the house. She ran into the twins in the hallway. She stopped, smiled. Good morning, gentlemen of silence. Today we have a cleaning special. If you give me a smile, I'll sing Baby Shark samba style. They didn't answer, they just stared. Ruby kept going. In the middle of cleaning, she felt something strange. She looked back. Ollie was standing in the doorway, and she heard a sound, low, rough, but clear, almost like a hi. Ruby's eyes widened. Hey, hi, he repeated. She pointed at herself. Me, the housekeeper? Ruby, you said hi? He nodded, then laughed, and ran off as if he had just stolen treasure. Liam followed right after, laughing too. Ruby just stood there, holding the mop like a magic scepter, smiling faintly, knowingly, and whispered, Hi to you too, little ones. Edward never said a word about what he saw on the cameras, but something in his routine began to change. For the first time in 2 years, he started leaving the office earlier, always with the same excuse, I need to check on things at home. The truth was, he wanted to see Ruby in action. And Ruby had turned cleaning into a real show. That Tuesday morning, she arrived humming a song she seemed to have made up on the way. Dust be gone, dirt goodbye, today this house will shine, oh yeah, oh yeah. She grabbed the vacuum cleaner and began dancing with it like it was her ballroom partner. She slid down the hall, spun around, and the vacuum followed her lead like an obedient partner. Come on, my dear Stanley, she said, giving the appliance a name. Today, you'll discover every corner of this mansion. From upstairs, Edward watched on the monitor, shaking his head but with an involuntary smile on his lips. Ruby had no idea she was being watched, much less that 2 pairs of curious eyes were spying on her every move. Ollie and Liam were hiding behind the living room sofa, completely fascinated by the woman who turned work into fun. When Ruby got close to the toys scattered on the floor, she stopped, looked around as if plotting something. She murmured, picking up a red fire truck. Looks like we have an emergency here. She gave each toy a different voice. Help, help, she cried in a tiny voice for a doll. The dust is attacking the city. Don't worry, citizens, she answered in a deep voice, holding the truck. The cleaning brigade is here to save the day. Ruby made up a whole story, with the little cart chasing dust monsters around the room, making siren noises and dramatic explosions. That's when it happened. A laugh. Clear, loud, genuine, then another one. Ruby stopped in the middle of her play acting and looked around. This time she saw them. Ollie and Liam were there, smiling openly, their eyes shining with joy. "Did you like the story?" she asked, slowly stepping closer. Liam nodded shyly. Ollie took a step forward with a slight grin. Without realizing it, Ruby knelt on the floor and opened her arms. To her surprise, both boys ran straight toward her. From the office, Edward watched with a tight chest. Anger and gratitude battled inside him. Ruby had disobeyed his direct orders not to get involved with the children. But for the first time in 2 years, his sons were happy. He was torn between going down to scold her or letting that magic continue. The decision was made for him when the housekeeper who had worked there for 15 years knocked on his office door. "Mr. Royce, I need to speak with you," she said, walking in with a stern expression. "What is it, Margaret?" "It's about the new employee." Edward frowned. "Ruby? Mrs. Thompson, the boy's nanny, came to me this morning. She's very worried." "Worried about what?" Margaret sighed, clearly uncomfortable. "Sir, Ruby is constantly interacting with the children. Not only during her work hours, she comes early, stays late, and, well, she's making quite a mess around the house." Edward kept his expression neutral, but inside he felt his irritation rising. "Go on." "Mrs. Thompson said that yesterday Ruby turned the living room into, how did she put it, a toy theater. There were toys scattered everywhere. She was singing loudly, making noise." Margaret paused. "Sir, that's not proper behavior for a respectable home." Edward was silent for a long moment. He looked at the monitor, where Ruby was still playing with his sons. "And the boys, how did they react?" Margaret seemed surprised by the question. "Well, they seemed to enjoy it, sir. But that's not the point. A cleaning lady should not behave like that, especially not with the children of the house." Edward kept watching the screen. He saw Ollie trying to copy Ruby's dance moves. He saw Liam laughing at something she said. He saw life where there had only been silence. "Thank you for letting me know, Margaret," he finally said. "I'll handle the situation." When Margaret left, Edward was alone with his conflicting thoughts. Ruby had disobeyed him. She had created chaos in his perfectly organized home, but she had given his children something he thought was lost forever: smiles. 3 days later, Ruby was in the middle of her morning routine when something caught her eye. In the corner of the main room, there was something mysterious covered by a white sheet, as if it had been forgotten by time. "What could be under there?" she murmured, walking closer with curiosity. Ruby gently pulled the edge of the fabric and uncovered a magnificent grand piano. The ivory keys gleamed even under the layer of dust, and the dark wood had a finish that spoke of elegance and care. "Wow, you're far too beautiful to be hidden like this," she said, running her fingers softly over the lid. Unable to resist, Ruby sat on the padded bench and placed her hands on the keys. She played a few simple chords, testing the sound. The piano answered with a sweet, melancholy melody that echoed through the room like a long-held sigh. "You have such a lovely voice," she whispered to the instrument, beginning to play a gentle song she had learned in childhood. The melody flowed naturally through her fingers, filling every corner of the mansion with a tenderness the house hadn't known in a very long time. From upstairs, Edward heard every note as if it were a knife piercing his chest. He dropped the papers he was reading and rushed down the stairs 2 at a time, his face growing paler with each step. When he reached the room, Ruby was still playing, completely absorbed in the music. Her eyes were closed, a small smile on her lips, as if she were speaking with an old friend. "Stop!" Edward shouted, making Ruby jump off the bench as if she had been shocked. Silence fell over the room like a heavy curtain. Edward stood at the entrance, breathing hard, his fists clenched, his face a mask of fury and pain. "Mr. Royce, I didn't know that," Ruby began, quickly getting to her feet. "You didn't know what? That you're not supposed to touch the things in this house? That there are rules here?" His voice shook with restrained anger. "I was only cleaning and saw the piano. I'm sorry, I didn't. No one touches that piano," Edward exploded, striding forward with firm steps. "No one. Do you understand?" Ruby stepped back instinctively, but her expression shifted from confusion to something more determined. "I understand that you're angry, but I don't understand why. It's just a piano." "Just a piano?" Edward let out a bitter laugh. "That piano was hers, my wife's. No one has touched it since she died." The silence that followed was different, heavier. Filled with a pain Ruby could almost reach out and touch. "Mr. Royce, I didn't know. I'm truly sorry, she said, her voice softer. Your apology doesn't change the fact that you disrespected this house again. Edward pointed at her. First with my children, and now with this. Fine, you're right about the piano, but about your children? Ruby crossed her arms. You saw them laugh for the first time in years, and you still think that was a bad thing? That's none of your business. Isn't it? Then tell me why you keep watching through the cameras when I'm with them? Ruby stepped closer. You spy on us because you know something good is happening. Edward opened his mouth to argue, but no words came. Your children are alive, Mr. Royce. They just need someone to remind them of that. Ruby went on. And if you fire me for making them smile, maybe the problem isn't me. How dare you? How dare I, what? Speak the truth. Ruby didn't back down. You've been so busy protecting your pain that you forgot to protect their happiness. Edward stayed silent, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on her. And about the piano? Ruby looked at the instrument and then back at him. I really am sorry. I didn't know the story. But can I tell you something? Edward didn't answer, but he didn't walk away either. Things only die when we stop thinking about them, she said simply. Music doesn't die, Mr. Royce. It only waits for someone to wake it up. Edward stood still for what felt like forever. Then, without a word, he turned and climbed the stairs, leaving Ruby alone in the room. She sighed, covered the piano again with the sheet, and went back to work. But something in the air of the house had shifted. For the rest of the day, Ruby noticed the twins sticking closer to her. They followed her through the hallways, no longer hiding, but openly curious. Do you want to help Aunt Ruby? She asked, holding two little cloths. Ollie grabbed one and tried to copy her movements. Liam did the same, but so clumsily that Ruby burst out laughing. Very good, cleaning crew. Now let's create our magic words. She began inventing silly words. When the dirt is stubborn, we shout, Zumba Lumba Cha. Zumba Lumba Cha, the boys repeated laughing. And when the vacuum chokes, we say, Piripake coffee. Piripake coffee. They yelled between giggles. And when we finish everything, we celebrate with Babaloo Chubaloo. Babaloo Chubaloo. The twins jumped, delighted by the ridiculous sound. Ruby had turned cleaning into a magic word game, and the boys were completely enchanted. From his office, Edward heard the laughter echoing through the house. Each sound was like a distant memory of when those walls still knew joy. He tried to focus on his reports, but the words on the screen blurred. His hands trembled slightly. That night, after Ruby had left and the boys were asleep, Edward went downstairs. The house was silent, only the ticking of the living room clock breaking the stillness. He stopped in front of the covered piano. Slowly he pulled off the sheet. The keys glistened under the soft lamplight. Edward sat on the bench, his hands hovering uncertainly over the keyboard. He played one note, then another. Little by little his fingers found a familiar melody, his wife's favorite, the one she used to play on Sunday mornings while the coffee boiled in the kitchen. Edward played carefully, as if the keys were made of glass. Each chord carried a memory. Her smile when she caught him listening from the doorway, the way she swayed her head to the rhythm, how she hummed softly under her breath. Silent tears rolled down his face. For the first time in 2 years, Edward Royce wasn't just remembering his wife. He was honoring her memory. And from the top of the stairs, 2 small figures watched in silence. Ollie and Liam had come down for water and found their father playing the piano. They glanced at each other and, without making a sound, went back to their rooms. The next morning, when Ruby arrived, she was greeted by 2 cheerful voices. Zumba Lumba Cha, Aunt Ruby. Babaloo Chubaloo. She laughed out loud, pulled them both into a tight hug, and whispered, Today we're going to invent even sillier words. And for the first time since she had arrived at that house, Ruby felt she was exactly where she was meant to be. Even though her boss still watched her with that complicated look she could never quite figure out, even though she knew she was walking on dangerous ground. The next morning, Ruby came in with her usual good spirits, but when she entered the twins' room for the daily cleaning, she found a scene that made her stop immediately. Ollie and Liam were lying on the bed, holding on to each other, their faces sad, so different from the joy of the past few days. Their little faces were turned toward the window, as if waiting for something that would never come. Hey, dynamic duo, Ruby said softly as she walked in. What's going on? You two look like little birds without a nest. The boys looked at her but didn't move. Ruby felt her heart tighten. Can I sit here with you? She asked, pointing to the edge of the bed. Ollie nodded, and Ruby lay down between them, staring at the ceiling. You know, when I was little and felt sad, my grandma would tell me silly stories to cheer me up. Do you want to hear one? Liam turned toward her, curious. Once upon a time, Ruby began in a dramatic voice, there were 3 terrible monsters that terrorized an entire city. The first was the messy hair monster with huge teeth and sharp claws. The boys leaned in closer. The second was the cold soup monster, who spit out ice and froze everything. And the third, she paused for effect, was the stinky sock monster, who had the most terrible power of all. What power? Ollie asked, forgetting his sadness. He could make people faint just by taking off his shoes. Ruby pretended to faint dramatically. The twins burst out laughing. But one day, she continued, a heroine showed up. Smelly sock girl. She had a special superpower. Her socks were so smelly that even the monsters were afraid of her. How's that? Liam asked, laughing. She got close to the monsters, took off her shoes. Ruby pretended to pull off invisible socks, and they screamed, "Oh no, what a horrible smell! Let's get out of here!" And they ran far, far away. The boys laughed so hard their bellies hurt. Ruby went on with the story, using funny voices for each character, exaggerated gestures, and silly sounds that completely erased the twins' sadness. From the doorway, Edward watched. He had come downstairs to get a report and heard the laughter. Seeing Ruby lying on the bed with his sons, telling absurd stories that made them laugh from the heart, he felt something strange in his chest. An impulse to walk in, to join that moment of pure happiness. He took a step forward, but stopped. That wasn't his place. That magic belonged to Ruby and the children. He went back to his office, but the image stayed fixed in his mind. 15 minutes later, Mrs. Thompson, the twins' official nanny, walked into the room and found the scene. Ruby still lying on the bed, the boys nestled in her arms, all of them laughing over a story about the dragon who was afraid of popcorn. What's going on here? The nanny asked in a stern voice. Ruby quickly got up, smoothing down her jumpsuit. Hello, Mrs. Thompson. I was just cleaning the room, and the boys seemed sad, so... That's not your job. The nanny cut in, crossing her arms. You were hired to clean, not to play nanny. I know, but they look so down, and I just wanted... You just wanted what? To step over my responsibilities? Mrs. Thompson moved closer. This is the 3rd time this week I've found you where you shouldn't be. Ruby felt irritation rising. Look, Mrs. Thompson, I respect your work, but how many times have I seen these boys alone and sad while you were on the phone or reading a magazine? How dare you accuse me? I'm not accusing you. I'm just saying that maybe, just maybe, they need a little more attention. Ruby kept her tone firm but respectful. I just want to make them happy. Making them happy is not your job. You're a housekeeper. And you're a nanny who seems to have forgotten how to care for children. Mrs. Thompson's face turned red with anger. We'll see what Mr. Royce thinks about this. She snapped, leaving the room with heavy steps. Ruby sighed, looked at the twins, who had watched everything with wide eyes. I'm sorry you had to see that, boys. Aunt Ruby just wants you happy, okay? They nodded and ran to hug her. In the office, Mrs. Thompson knocked loudly on the door. Mr. Royce, I need to speak with you right away. Come in, Edward said, without lifting his eyes from the papers. Sir, I can't take it anymore. That woman is completely out of control. The nanny gestured nervously. Today I found her lying on the bed with the children. Lying down, Mr. Royce. Edward looked up. And what else? She disrespected me, questioned my work, said I don't take proper care of the boys. Mrs. Thompson's voice grew sharper and sharper. Sir, I've worked for respectable families for 15 years. I've never been through such humiliation. Edward was silent for a moment. Mrs. Thompson, do you want me to fire Ruby? Yes, immediately, or I will resign. I can't work under these conditions. Edward sighed. All right, stay here. I'll take care of this now. He went downstairs and found Ruby in the twins' room, tidying up toys while humming softly. The boys were helping, handing her the objects. Ruby, he said from the doorway. She turned, already expecting trouble. Yes, Mr. Royce? I've asked you several times not to get involved with my children. You don't listen. Mr. Royce, I can explain. You're fired, he said flatly. Silence fell in the room like a bomb. Ruby felt her legs weaken, but she held on to her dignity. I understand, she said, her voice trembling. I'll gather my things. At that moment, Ollie and Liam, who had been listening from the bathroom door, rushed into the room. No, Ollie shouted, clinging to Ruby's right leg. Ruby stays, said Liam, holding on tightly to her left leg. Edward froze. His sons, who had barely spoken for 2 years, were now speaking clearly to defend the housemaid. Ruby is good, Ollie said, looking at his father with tears in his eyes. Daddy, Ruby stays, Liam begged. Ruby knelt down and hugged them both. It's all right, my loves. Your daddy knows what's best. Edward looked at the scene, his children crying, holding on to the woman who had brought light back into their lives, the woman he was firing for following strict rules that perhaps no longer made sense. Without a word, he went back to his office. Mrs. Thompson was waiting, smiling in triumph. So, sir, has she left already? Edward looked straight at her. Mrs. Thompson, I've changed my mind. Ruby will not be fired. The nanny's smile vanished. What do you mean, sir? We had an agreement. The agreement was that I would handle the situation, and I did. Ruby stays. But, sir, this is unacceptable. Either she goes or I go. Edward sighed. Then, Mrs. Thompson, I accept your resignation. Margaret will take care of your final payment. The nanny's jaw dropped. Mr. Royce, you can't be serious. I'm completely serious. Have a good day. Half an hour later, Edward found Ruby in the kitchen, teaching the twins how to arrange the utensils by size. Ruby, he called. She turned, clearly nervous. Mr. Royce, I was already getting ready to leave. From now on, you can also take care of the children, he interrupted. I'll pay you 3 times more for your work. You'll still be responsible for the cleaning, but the priority will be the boys. Ruby's eyes widened. Really? You're sure? I am. But on one condition, never touch the piano again without permission. Promise, she said, smiling. The twins jumped with joy, hugging Ruby's legs again. The next day, Ruby had a brilliant idea. Mr. Royce, she said, appearing at the office door, how about helping us with a special cleaning today? What do you mean? The boys want their daddy to join our magical cleaning team. Edward looked at his sons, who were standing behind Ruby, making pleading faces. Daddy, come on, Ollie said. It's fun. Liam added. Against all his corporate instincts, Edward gave in. The cleaning operation turned into real comic chaos. Edward, wearing casual clothes for the first time in years, tried to follow Ruby's instructions, but everything went wrong. He spilled the bucket of water 3 times, slipped on the soap, got tangled in the vacuum hose, and almost brought down a bookshelf when he tried to steady himself. Daddy is silly, Liam shouted, laughing. Edward felt tears well up. He bent down and hugged his son tightly. Yes, I'm a silly daddy, he said, laughing and crying at the same time. He was overwhelmed with emotion, seeing his children talking and happy after so long. Ruby watched the scene with a little smile. Edward couldn't quite read. There was something in her eyes, a tenderness mixed with quiet satisfaction, as if she knew this was only the beginning of something much greater. The following afternoon, Ruby appeared at Edward's office with a proposal he never expected to hear. Mr. Royce, how about having dinner with your children tonight? Edward looked up from his reports, frowning. We always have dinner together in the dining room at 7 sharp. No, Ruby shook her head, smiling. I'm talking about a real dinner. In the kitchen. No Margaret serving, no porcelain plates, no starched napkins. Just you 3 and me, if you'll allow it. Ruby, we have a protocol. Protocols are for business meetings, not for families, she gently interrupted. When was the last time you actually talked with Ollie and Liam during a meal? Edward opened his mouth to answer, but realized he couldn't remember. Meals were always silent, formal, the boys eating politely while he checked emails on his phone. Let's make tacos, Ruby said excitedly. The boys will love it. It's fun, messy, and everyone takes part. Tacos? Edward sounded as if he'd just heard a word in a foreign language. Simple. Tortillas, meat, cheese, veggies, sauce. Everyone builds their own however they want. It's like an edible puzzle. Ollie and Liam appeared at the office door as if summoned by telepathy. Papa, let's make tacos, Ollie said, jumping. With melted cheese, Liam added. Edward looked at the 3 hopeful faces in front of him and felt his resistance crumble. All right, he sighed, but let's keep things civilized. Ruby laughed. Mr. Royce, if tacos end up civilized, then we've done something wrong. An hour later, the mansion's kitchen had turned into a culinary battlefield. Edward, who had traded his suit for a casual shirt and jeans, thanks to Ruby's insistence, stood at the stove trying to brown the ground beef under the shouted instructions of 3 different teachers. "More seasoning," Ruby called out. "Dad, don't let it burn," Ollie warned. "Stir, stir, stir," Liam sang, clapping his hands. "I know what I'm doing," Edward muttered, clearly not knowing what he was doing. Meanwhile, Ruby and the twins worked on the toppings, or at least tried. "Ollie, no. The cheese goes in the bowl, not on your brother," Ruby laughed, stopping a grated cheese war. "But he started it," Ollie protested, crumbs of cheese stuck in his hair. "I didn't do anything." Liam defended himself, clearly guilty. Ruby grabbed a handful of cheese and tossed it in the air, letting it fall over her own head. "There. Now we're all the same." Problem solved. The boys burst out laughing, and Edward, who had turned to see what was happening, couldn't help but smile. "The meat's burning," Liam warned, pointing to the stove. "Oh no!" Edward rushed back, but in his haste slipped on a piece of lettuce that had fallen on the floor. His arms flailed, searching for balance. He grabbed the counter, but ended up knocking over the bowl of chopped tomatoes, which flew in every direction. "Watch out!" Ruby shouted, diving to save the salsa, but bumped into Edward instead. The two ended up in a clumsy dance, trying not to step on the tomatoes scattered across the floor, Ruby clutching the salsa jar like it was a baby, Edward still holding the spatula. "It's raining tomatoes," Ollie cheered. "It's a food storm," Liam added. Ruby and Edward looked at each other, covered in flour, cheese, and tomatoes, and began to laugh. First softly, then louder, until they were laughing like mischievous teenagers. "Dad looks like a flour ghost," Liam said, "and Ruby looks like a walking cheese," Ollie added. That only made them laugh harder. 40 minutes later, they finally managed to gather enough ingredients to make tacos. The kitchen looked as if a food hurricane had hit it. Flour on the walls, cheese on the ceiling, lettuce stuck to the fridge, and a mysterious salsa footprint on the tile. But nobody cared. Sitting around the kitchen island on tall stools, each one built their taco with the creativity of an artist. Edward discovered he liked extra cheese and pickles. Ollie created a masterpiece with 5 different sauces. Liam decided tortillas work better as hats before eating them. "Papa, tell us about your childhood," Ollie asked, chewing. "My childhood?" Edward seemed surprised. "Why do you want to know?" "Ruby told us that when she was little, she lived with her grandma, who made pancakes shaped like animals," Liam said. "What about you?" Edward thought for a moment. It had been so long since he'd spoken about his childhood. "Well, my grandfather used to teach me to fish every summer. We always went to Cedar Lake, and he said the secret was to have patience and talk to the fish." "Talk to the fish?" Ollie's eyes widened. "That's right. He said if you told funny stories, they'd get curious and come see what was going on." "And did it work?" Liam asked, fascinated. "Sometimes," Edward smiled, a nostalgic expression on his face. "Or maybe my grandfather was just very good at choosing the right places." Ruby stayed quiet, watching Edward transform in front of his children. His words flowed naturally, his gestures were more relaxed, and there was a light in his eyes she had never seen before. "Ruby, tell us more about the pancake grandma," Ollie asked. Grandma Carmen was an artist," Ruby said with dramatic gestures. "She made elephant pancakes, giraffe pancakes, even dragon pancakes, and she always said, 'Mia, food made with love tastes different.'" "Mia?" Liam asked, confused. "That's what she called me. It means my daughter in Spanish," Ruby explained. "She was Mexican. She came to the United States when she was young." "Like you?" Edward observed. Ruby blinked, a little surprised by his comment. "Yes, like me. 2nd generation of dreamers." They kept talking while finishing their tacos. The stories flowed easily. Ruby shared about her childhood in a small apartment in San Antonio. Edward recalled long-forgotten memories from his youth, and the boys asked 1,000 questions about everything. When they finally finished eating, the kitchen was even messier, but no one wanted the moment to end. "Best dinner of my life," Ollie declared, sprawled on the stool with his belly full. "I agree," Liam said, yawning. Edward looked around at the wrecked kitchen, then at his happy, satisfied sons, and finally at Ruby, who was gathering plates with a serene smile on her face. He called softly, "Yes? How do you manage to make everything feel so alive?" Ruby stopped, a plate in her hand, and looked at him. There was something different in his question. It wasn't shallow curiosity, it was a genuine search for understanding. "Because I never had the luxury of living on autopilot," she answered simply. "When you grow up knowing every day is an achievement, you learn to find magic in the small things." Edward studied her in silence. There was depth in Ruby that he was only beginning to discover. She wasn't just the funny housekeeper who made his children laugh. She was a woman who understood what it meant to truly live. "And you?" Ruby asked back. "When did you stop living and start just existing?" The question hit him like a punch to the stomach. Edward had no answer, because he knew exactly when it had happened. The day his wife died, when he decided he would never let anything hurt him that deeply again. "Papa, can we do this every day?" Ollie asked, breaking the tense moment. Every day might be too much work for Ruby. Edward replied, bringing himself back to reality. "Work?" Ruby laughed. "Mr. Royce, this wasn't work. This was life." The twins began cleaning the mess without anyone asking, imitating Ruby's dance moves while they picked up the bits of food scattered around. Edward and Ruby worked side by side, washing dishes and wiping surfaces. Now and then their hands brushed when reaching for the same utensil, or their shoulders touched as they moved around the small sink. They were innocent, accidental touches, but they left a strange feeling in the air. "Zumba lumba cha!" the boys shouted when they finished, using the magic word Ruby had invented. "Babaloo chubaloo," Ruby answered, laughing. Edward watched the scene, and for the first time in 2 years, he couldn't imagine his house without that laughter echoing through the halls. Without that extraordinary woman who had transformed his family before he even realized how. And that scared him just as much as it gave him hope. 3 days after the taco dinner, Ruby was tidying up the playroom when she found a pink tablet forgotten under the sofa. She recognized it right away as Ollie's, the one he always carried everywhere before. Well, before he stopped caring about almost everything. That boy would forget his head if it weren't attached. She muttered, picking up the device to take it to the twins' room. But when she touched the screen to check if it was working, the tablet lit up and automatically started playing the last video that had been watched. Ruby was about to turn it off when the image froze her in place. On the screen, a beautiful woman with golden hair was sitting on the floor of the very same room where Ruby now stood. She wore a light blue dress and held 2 chubby babies in her lap. The video quality showed it had been recorded a few years earlier. "Ollie, my love, say mama," the woman said on the screen, tickling one of the babies. "Come on, you can do it." The baby laughed, trying to grab his mother's hair. "And you, Liam, are you going to let your brother win?" She turned to the other baby, who immediately started babbling incomprehensible sounds. Ruby slowly sat down on the sofa, mesmerized by the scene. This was clearly the boy's mother, Edward's wife. The woman who had left such a deep emptiness in the house that her absence could still be felt 2 years later. The video went on. The camera, apparently held by Edward, captured intimate, spontaneous moments. The woman sang lullabies, made funny faces at the babies, imitated animal sounds that made them burst into laughter. "Sarah, are you recording our secret clown training session?" Edward's voice came from the tablet, younger and full of life. "Someone needs to document that you actually know how to smile, Mr. Serious CEO," Sarah answered, turning to the camera with a radiant smile. "Look, boys, Daddy is happy." The camera shook, showing that Edward was laughing. Ruby felt her eyes fill with tears. It was impossible not to be moved watching that happy family, whole, filled with love and hope. Edward looked like a completely different person in the video, relaxed, playful, fully present. The video shifted to another scene. Sarah was teaching the babies, now a little older, to clap their hands. She sang a children's song while moving their tiny hands to the rhythm. "If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands," she sang. "If you're happy and you know it and you really want to show it, clap your hands." The babies tried to copy, producing clumsy claps that made Sarah laugh out loud. "Edward, come here," she called. "You need to join our band." "I'm working, love," came his distracted voice. "Work can wait 5 minutes. Your kids won't be babies forever." There was a pause, then the sound of footsteps coming closer. Edward appeared on the screen and sat next to Sarah on the floor. All right, what's my part in this family orchestra? You're the bass, Sarah said, taking his hand and guiding it to clap in a slower rhythm. Like this, see? Perfect. Ruby watched the scene with a lump in her throat. There was proof that Edward had once been capable of being spontaneous, of living in the moment, of putting his family first. What had happened to that man? Ruby? The voice behind her made her jump from the sofa as if she had been shocked. Edward was standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Mr. Royce, I found Ollie's tablet and, she stammered, fumbling to turn off the device, but her hands were trembling. Give me that, he said, stretching out his hand in a dry tone. Ruby hesitated. On the screen, Sarah was now singing a lullaby, the twins, about a year old, falling asleep in her arms. Mr. Royce, Ruby, turn it off now. His voice was tense, almost desperate. She looked at the screen, then at him, and saw something that made her decide. Instead of handing over the tablet, Ruby held it tighter. No. What do you mean, no? They need to remember her laughing, Ruby said softly, and so do you. Edward took a step forward, reaching his hand out more firmly. Ruby, you don't understand. I understand that you're afraid, she cut in, standing up but keeping the tablet out of his reach. But look, she turned the screen toward him. In the video, Sarah was tickling the twins, who laughed with pure, contagious joy. Look how much she loved them. Look how happy you all were. Edward froze, his eyes locked on the image of his wife. His expression hardened. You think I don't know that? You think I forgot? I think you're trying to forget, Ruby replied gently. And you're dragging your children with you. You have no right. I have the right to care about these children, she interrupted, but without aggression. Edward, they barely have memories of her. Liam was hardly 2 when she died. Edward tried once more to grab the tablet, but Ruby caught his hand. The touch was electric. Unexpected. Intense. For a moment, both froze, their hands still entwined, the tablet between them showing images of a family that had once been whole. Please, Ruby whispered, let me watch. Let yourself remember her the way she really was. Edward looked at their hands, still joined, then at Ruby's face. There was something in her eyes he couldn't resist. Compassion, maybe. Or an understanding that went beyond words. Slowly, he released her hand and sat heavily on the sofa. Ruby sat beside him, keeping a respectful distance, and held the tablet so they both could see. The video went on. Sarah was now reading a book to the twins, using different voices for each character. Edward appeared from time to time in the video, joining the story, making the boys laugh. She was good at that, Edward murmured, breaking the silence. She was. You can see she was born to be a mother. She always said she wanted a house full of children. Edward went on, his voice unsteady. 5, 6 kids. She said she wanted so much noise the neighbors would complain. Ruby smiled through her tears. She managed to make a lot of noise with just 2. On the tablet, Sarah was now singing a song Ruby recognized, the same melody she had hummed unconsciously a few times while cleaning. Sunshine, you are my sunshine. Sarah sang in the video. You sing that song, Edward noted, looking at Ruby. My grandmother used to sing it to me, she answered. Funny how some songs pass through generations, isn't it? They kept watching in silence. The video showed everyday moments. Sarah bathing the babies, Edward trying and failing miserably to change diapers, the 4 of them in the garden having an improvised picnic. She would have turned 70 next week, Edward said suddenly. Ruby looked at him, confused. What do you mean? Sarah died at 28. If she were alive, she would be... He stopped, realizing the mistake. Sorry, she would be 30. I still get it wrong sometimes. Ruby felt her chest tighten. Edward was so lost in his grief that at times he even forgot the passing of time. The video ended and the screen went dark. They sat in silence for a long moment. Thank you, Edward finally said. For what? For making me remember that she was more than just pain. Ruby nodded, discreetly wiping away a tear that had slipped down her face. Your children deserve to know that version of her, and that version of you too. Edward looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Something was shifting between them, something beyond the employer-employee bond, something both were beginning to recognize, though neither knew how to handle it. Ruby, he said softly. Yes? Thank you for not giving up on us. And for the first time since she had arrived at that house, Ruby understood it wasn't only about making the children smile. It was about teaching an entire family how to live again. On Friday morning, Ruby woke with a strange feeling. The sun came through the window of her small apartment in a special way, as if inviting her to something different. She looked outside and saw children playing in the park across the street, their laughter floating in the air. That's when she had the idea. When she arrived at the Royce mansion, she found Ollie and Liam in their room, quietly playing with building blocks. They looked content, but there was a dullness in the way they played. Always the same toys, always the same controlled environment. "Good morning, Team Smiles," Ruby said, stepping in with her usual energy. "Good morning, Ruby," they answered together, running to hug her. "How about we do something different today?" she asked, kneeling to be at their level. "Like what?" Ollie asked, curious. Ruby glanced out the window. It was one of those perfect spring days in Chicago. Blue sky, pleasant temperature, a soft breeze making the trees dance. "How about we explore the world outside?" The twins looked at each other, puzzled. "Outside where?" Liam asked. "To the park. That beautiful park, just 2 blocks from here. Have you ever been there?" The boys shook their heads. "Papa says it's dangerous," Ollie said. "And that there are too many strangers," Liam added. Ruby's heart sank. Those children were being deprived of one of the most important parts of childhood. The freedom to play with other kids. "You know what I think?" she said, making an impulsive decision. "I think you two deserve to know what real play feels like." "But Papa's in his office in meetings until 5. Ruby checked her watch. "It's only 2 in the afternoon. We have plenty of time for a little adventure." She knew she was breaking all the rules. Edward had been clear about not leaving the property with the children without permission. But seeing those 2 beautiful boys trapped inside a glass dome, Ruby felt some rules were meant to be broken. "But if Papa finds out?" Ollie hesitated. "I'll take all the responsibility," Ruby promised. "Do you trust Aunt Ruby?" Both nodded without hesitation. "Then let's go live an adventure." 15 minutes later, Ruby was walking through the neighborhood streets with a twin on each side, their little hands holding hers tightly. The boys looked around with the curiosity of explorers discovering a new continent. "Wow, so many cars!" Liam exclaimed. "And look at that dog!" Ollie pointed to a golden retriever walking with its owner. Ruby smiled as she watched their amazement at such ordinary things. When they reached the park, the twins' eyes widened. It's huge," Ollie whispered. Millennium Park was full of life. Children were running across the lawns, families were having picnics, and teenagers were tossing frisbees. There was a colorful playground with slides, swings, and a climbing structure that looked like a castle. Can I go there?" Liam asked, pointing to the slide. "Of course, let's go." Ruby walked with them to the playground. At first, the twins were shy, watching the other children from a distance, but Ruby encouraged them gently. "Look," she said, pointing to a boy their age who was playing alone in the sandbox. "That little boy seems nice. Why don't you go over?" Ollie was the first to approach. "Hi," he said shyly. "Can I play?" The boy looked up and smiled. "Sure, I'm building a castle. Want to help?" Within minutes, the 3 of them were working together, creating an elaborate sand fortress. Liam soon joined in, and then 2 more girls came over, curious. Ruby sat on a nearby bench, watching in amazement. The twins were talking, laughing, and working out who would do which part of the castle. They were normal children again, social, fun, exactly as they should be. "Are they yours?" asked a mother who sat down beside Ruby. "I take care of them," Ruby answered without going into details. "They're adorable. First time at the park?" "Yes," Ruby smiled sadly. "First time in a long time." For almost an hour, the twins played freely. They went down slides, swung on the swings, ran, shouted with joy, and got dirty with dirt and sand. Ruby took a few photos with her phone, wanting to capture those magical moments. That was when she saw Edward. He was on the other side of the park, near the parking lot, scanning with desperate eyes. When he finally spotted them, his face went through several emotions: relief, anger, confusion. Ruby swallowed hard. She was in trouble. Edward walked toward them with long, determined strides. Ruby could see the storm forming on his face. "Boys," she called softly, "it's time to go." "Already?" Ollie protested. "But I haven't finished the castle. We'll come back another day," Ruby promised, though she wasn't sure if it was true. Edward reached them just as Ruby was helping the boys say goodbye to their new friends. "Dad," Liam shouted, running to hug his father's legs. "You had to see it! We made a giant castle! And we met Jake, Emma, Sophie, and Marcus," Ollie added excitedly. "They're really nice." Edward looked at his sons, dirty, happy, glowing, and then at Ruby. She stood a few steps back, clearly bracing for the storm. "Ruby," he said, his voice controlled. "Can we talk?" She stepped closer, lifting her chin with determination. "Mr. Royce, I know you're upset, but you disobeyed a direct order." He cut her off. "I told you not to leave the property with them." "I know, but—" "No buts, Ruby. You put my children at risk." Ruby looked around. The park was full of happy families, children playing under the watchful care of parents and guardians. There was nothing dangerous there. At risk of what? Of being happy? Of making friends? Of being normal kids? "Dad, don't be mad at Ruby," Ollie interrupted. "It was the best afternoon of our lives." "It's true." Liam agreed. "We had so much fun." Edward looked at his children, then at Ruby, then at the park around them. He saw other children playing, other parents smiling, entire families enjoying a beautiful day outdoors. He took a deep breath. "Thank you," he said, surprising even himself. Ruby blinked, confused. "I'm sorry?" "Thank you," he repeated, more firmly. "For reminding me they need this." Ruby felt her eyes fill with tears. "Mr. Royce," Edward, he corrected her softly. "I think it's time you called me Edward." The walk back home was completely different from the way there. The twins chattered non-stop about their adventures, telling every detail to their father as if they were explorers returning from an epic expedition. Edward walked beside Ruby, listening to his children's stories with an expression she had never seen before. It was tenderness mixed with regret, joy touched with a quiet sadness. "They were right," he said as they reached the gates of the mansion. "About what?" It really was the best afternoon of their lives, since a very long time ago. Ruby didn't answer, but her heart warmed. As they crossed the mansion's garden, she was so distracted watching Edward interact with his sons that she didn't notice where she was stepping. Her foot slipped on the grass still wet from the irrigation system. "Careful!" Edward shouted, lunging to catch her. His arms closed around Ruby's waist at the exact moment she began to fall. The momentum made them spin, and when they finally stopped, she was pressed against his chest, her hands resting on his shoulders. The two of them froze. Ruby could feel Edward's heart pounding against his chest. She could see every detail of his green eyes, the small scar near his left eyebrow, the way his lips parted slightly. Edward looked at her, as if he were seeing her for the very first time. Her face flushed from the walk, her eyes shining with genuine happiness, her lips slightly parted in surprise. They leaned closer, slowly, inevitably. It was as if the entire world had stopped to watch that moment. The wind stilled, the birds went silent, even the twins grew quiet. Closer. Edward's lips nearly touched Ruby's. "Daddy!" Ollie shouted. "Did you see? A blue butterfly." They pulled apart quickly as if waking from a trance. Ruby nervously smoothed her hair. Edward cleared his throat and adjusted a tie he wasn't even wearing. Ruby began. "We should," Edward said at the same time. They looked at each other and laughed awkwardly. "Let's go inside," Edward suggested, still unable to take his eyes off her. "Good idea," Ruby agreed, her heart still racing. As they walked toward the house, neither of them mentioned what had almost happened. But both knew something had changed forever. In the 3 days following the almost kiss in the garden, Ruby and Edward developed an impressive ability to avoid each other. She arrived earlier and stayed downstairs. He left the office later and always found an excuse not to come down when she was around. It was like an elaborate dance of avoidance, and the only ones who didn't understand the game were Ollie and Liam. "Why doesn't Daddy eat dinner with us anymore?" Ollie asked on Wednesday, stirring his soup sadly. "And why does Ruby turn red when someone talks about Daddy?" Liam observed, with the sharpness typical of a 6-year-old. Ruby nearly choked on her dinner. "I don't turn red," she protested, clearly blushing. "Yes, you do," Ollie insisted, "just like when we eat chili peppers." That was the moment the twins had the idea. On Thursday morning, while Ruby was cleaning the library, she heard excited whispers upstairs. Then hurried footsteps, muffled giggles, and the unmistakable sound of children plotting something. "Margaret," Ollie called, running into the kitchen. "Can you help us with a secret project?" The housekeeper, who had grown especially fond of the twins since Ruby had brought them back to life, raised a curious eyebrow. "What kind of secret project?" "A surprise party," Liam declared, as if it were the most brilliant idea in history. "And who's the party for?" The boys looked at each other. For Ruby and Daddy to be friends again," Ollie said, with the brutal honesty of children. Margaret smiled. She had noticed the strange tension between the two in recent days. "And what do you need for this party?" "Everything," they shouted together. 2 hours later, the living room had been transformed into a scene worthy of a children's party planned by 6-year-olds. There were colorful paper flags hanging completely unevenly, balloons taped to the walls, a makeshift table with all the snacks from the pantry, crackers, cookies, chips, a few pieces of fruit. Margaret had insisted on adding an apple juice poured into crystal glasses because a party has to be fancy. The special touch was the handmade paper hats, decorated with drawings of flowers that looked more like colorful explosions, and little notes scattered around the room with messages like, "Ruby, you are the best cleaning lady in the world, and Daddy likes you. Daddy smiles when Ruby is here. You two are silly, but we love you." Ollie and Liam waited patiently until Edward came down for lunch and Ruby appeared to clean the room. "Surprise!" the two of them shouted when Ruby opened the door. She stopped, speechless, taking in the chaotic but love-filled decorations. "What is this?" "It's a party so you and Daddy can be friends again," Liam explained, placing a pink paper hat on her head. "Friends? We've always been." Ruby began, but was interrupted by Edward's arrival. He stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene. Ruby with a ridiculous hat on her head, the boys wearing their own homemade hats, the living room decorated as if a colorful tornado had swept through. "Daddy!" Ollie ran to him and placed a crooked blue hat on his head. "You made it just in time for our friendship party." Edward looked at Ruby. Ruby looked at him. Both were wearing paper hats made by 6-year-olds, in the middle of a room decorated with all the subtlety of a carnival. It was impossible to hold on to any tension in such an absurd situation. Ruby was the first to laugh, a soft chuckle that grew into a full, genuine laugh. Edward followed, laughing at the scene, the ridiculous hats, and his children's determination to fix a problem they didn't even know existed. "Very well," he said, adjusting the hat on his head. "What's on the program for this party?" "First, you two have to sit on the couch together," instructed Liam, clearly following a carefully laid plan. Together, Ollie reinforced, pushing Ruby toward the couch. Super close. Ruby and Edward sat down, keeping a respectful distance, but the twins weren't satisfied. "Closer," insisted Liam, literally shoving Ruby to the side until she was pressed against Edward's arm. "Now you eat cookies and talk about grown-up stuff," Ollie declared, holding out a plate of cookies. "What kind of grown-up stuff?" Edward asked, genuinely curious about his children's perspective. "I don't know. Work? Bills? Why you act weird whenever you're in the same room," Liam said with devastating honesty. Ruby choked on her cookie. "We don't act weird," Edward defended. "Yes, you do," Ollie insisted. "You act like the characters in Margaret's movies who stare at each other and then run away." From the kitchen door, Margaret chuckled softly. "Now you have to make a toast," Liam announced, handing them each a glass of juice. "A toast to what?" Ruby asked. To. Ollie thought for a moment. "To our family." Ruby and Edward looked at each other. The word family hung in the air like a question without an answer. "To our family," Edward said softly, raising his glass. "To our family," Ruby repeated, clinking hers against his. The twins clapped as if they had just witnessed the greatest victory in history. The party went on for another half hour, with the boys inventing silly games like, "Who can eat the most cookies without laughing?" Impossible once Ollie started making faces, and statue dance with hats, which ended with everyone piled on the floor laughing. When the fun finally began to settle down, Edward cleared his throat. "Actually, I wanted to invite you to something," he said, speaking mostly to Ruby but including the boys. "To what?" she asked. "Tomorrow night there's an event at the boys' school, a musical performance followed by dinner. I would like you to come with us." Ruby blinked, surprised. As your guest?" "As part of the family," he said simply. The twins erupted with joy as if it were the best Christmas present of their lives. "Ruby's coming with us," Ollie sang. It's going to be the best night ever," Liam added, mixing Portuguese and English adorably. Ruby looked at Edward, searching for any sign that he was just being polite. But there was something genuine in his eyes, a real invitation to be part of something bigger. "I'd love to," she said softly. The next evening, Ruby dressed more carefully than she had in years. She chose a simple but elegant navy blue dress, pinned her hair into a low bun, and even borrowed lipstick from her neighbor. When she came downstairs to meet Edward and the twins, her heart raced. Edward looked striking in a dark gray suit, and the boys were adorable in matching blazers. "Ruby," Liam shouted, "you look like a princess." "A very beautiful princess," Ollie added. Edward gave a quiet nod, but the look he gave her spoke far more than words. The event at Riverside Elementary School was filled with elegant families. Ruby felt a little intimidated at first, but Edward stayed by her side, introducing her naturally as Ruby, who takes care of the boys. During the musical performance, Ollie and Liam sang a song about farm animals with their class. Ruby watched with eyes brimming with proud tears, as if they were her own children up on stage. "They're wonderful," she whispered to Edward. "They are," he agreed. "And look how confident they are. That's new." After the performance, the twins' teacher, Miss Henderson, came over to them. "Mr. Royce, what a pleasure to see you here. And you must be Ruby," she said warmly, smiling. "The boys talk about you all the time. I hope it's good things." Ruby laughed. "Wonderful things. In fact, I wanted to talk with you both about the remarkable progress Ollie and Liam have been making in recent weeks." Edward straightened, suddenly attentive. "What kind of progress?" "Well, when they first joined my class at the start of the year, they barely interacted with the other kids. They always stayed together, spoke quietly, and seemed distant. But these last few weeks, it's like they've become completely different children." Ruby and Edward exchanged a look. "What do you mean?" Ruby asked. "Now they start conversations with other kids, they take part in group activities, they even lead games at recess. Yesterday, Ollie helped a new student join the group. It's a remarkable change." Edward looked over at the twins, playing with the other children, lively and social. "Thank you so much for telling us," he said. "You're welcome. You're doing a wonderful job with them. It's clear there's a lot of love at home." When the teacher walked away, Ruby and Edward stayed silent for a moment. "She thinks we're married," Ruby said softly. "I know," Edward replied. "And you know what's strange? For a moment, I forgot we weren't." Before Ruby could respond, a school photographer came over. "Sorry to interrupt, but would you like a family picture? We're taking photos of all the families tonight." Ruby hesitated, ready to step back. "Actually," she began. "We'd love to," Edward interrupted, gently placing a hand on her back. The twins ran ahead to take their spots, and Ruby found herself standing between Edward and Liam, with Ollie on his father's other side. "Say cheese," the photographer instructed. "Cheese," they all shouted, Ruby included. The flash went off, capturing a moment that felt completely natural, completely real. A family. When they received the photo a few minutes later, Ruby held it with trembling hands. There they were, Edward with a genuine smile, her own face glowing, and the twins looking absolutely joyful between them. It looked so real, so right, so much like something she hadn't even known she wanted until that very moment. "Could I keep a copy?" she asked softly. "Keep this one," Edward said. "I'll order another for us." "For us?" The words echoed in Ruby's mind all the way back home, while the twins dozed in the back seat and Edward drove in silence. For a moment in that school, she had felt part of something she'd never had. A real family. On Saturday morning, Ruby woke up earlier than usual in her small apartment. The family photo was on her nightstand, and she had caught herself looking at it at least 10 times before falling asleep the night before. She made coffee and called her mother in San Antonio, as she did every weekend. "Hola, mija." Carmen Gonzalez's warm voice came from the other end of the line. "How are things over there?" "Hi, Mom. It's all complicated." "Complicated how? Work's not going well?" Ruby sighed, staring out the window at the quiet streets of Chicago. "Work is great, better than great, actually. It's just that..." She hesitated. "I think I'm being foolish. I'm getting attached." "Attached to what, mija?" "To the kids. To the house. To him." There was a pause on the other end. "Oh," Carmen said with that tone mothers use when they know exactly what's going on. "And him?" He's my boss, Mom. He's a widower, he has 2 kids, he's a millionaire, and I'm his housekeeper. It's impossible. Ruby Isabel Gonzalez, Carmen said firmly. Since when do you define yourself by your job? You're much more than that. But Mom? No buts. You have a heart as big as Texas and a beautiful soul. If this man can't see that, it's his loss, not yours. Ruby felt her eyes fill with tears. It's just sometimes I forget I'm not really part of his family. Yesterday we took a picture together, and for a moment I truly believed that. That what? That maybe I belonged there. Carmen was silent for a moment. Mia, have you talked to him about what you're feeling? Of course not. That would be the fastest way to get fired. Or maybe it would be the most beautiful surprise of his life, Carmen suggested gently. Sometimes people just need someone to be brave first. While Ruby was talking with her mother in her apartment, across town, Edward was having a similar conversation with his older sister, Diana. You seem different, Diana observed, having come over for lunch and to bring gifts for her nephews. More alive. Edward was making sandwiches in the kitchen, something Diana hadn't seen him do in the past 2 years. Different how? I don't know. Lighter. The boys seem different too. They're talking, acting like normal kids. They've always been normal kids, Edward said defensively. Ed, you know that's not true. Since Sarah died, they've been absent, and so have you. Edward stopped slicing tomatoes and looked at his sister. And now? Now you all seem like a real family again. What changed? Edward hesitated. We hired a new helper. Ruby. She takes care of the boys and, well, she sort of turned everything upside down. Upside down how? She makes the boys laugh. They sing with her, play, make up silly games. Yesterday they even threw a surprise party for me and Ruby because they thought we were upset with each other. Diana smiled. And were you? We were avoiding each other, Edward admitted. It's complicated. Complicated why? Edward let out a deep sigh. I don't know what's happening, Diana, but she has become the center of the house. When she's not here, everything feels empty. The boys ask for her. I catch myself wondering what she would say about something. Even the food tastes better when she's around. Edward, Diana placed her hand on her brother's arm. You're falling in love with her. Don't be ridiculous. I'm being realistic. You just described all the classic signs. Edward shook his head. She's an employee, Diana, and I can't do that to Sarah. Sarah's been gone for 2 years, Ed, Diana said gently. And if she were here, she'd be the first to push you toward happiness again. Edward stayed quiet, taking in his sister's words. Besides, Diana continued, from what you've told me, she's not just an employee. She's the one who brought your family back to life. In the days that followed, both Ruby and Edward were lost in their own thoughts, trying to make sense of the confusing feelings they were experiencing. Ruby caught herself daydreaming while cleaning, imagining what it would be like if this really were her home. If the twins were really her children, if Edward looked at her as more than the person who cared for his family. Edward, on his side, started noticing small details he had never paid attention to before. How Ruby hummed while she worked, how her eyes lit up when the boys told a story, how she bit her lower lip when she was concentrating. It was on Wednesday that everything changed. Ruby arrived at the mansion at her usual time, but as she came closer to the main entrance, she froze as if she had been struck. Edward was at the front door with a stunning woman. She was tall, elegant, with flawless blonde hair, dressed in a red suit that probably cost more than Ruby earned in 3 months. They were speaking in an intimate way, and the woman touched Edward's arm while laughing at something he said. Ruby hid behind one of the cars parked in the driveway, her heart racing. The woman was clearly from Edward's world. Sophisticated, beautiful, probably well-educated, and with an enviable bank account. Everything Ruby was not. Thank you for letting me come to your home, Ed, the woman said, her voice carrying clearly to where Ruby hid. I know it's not easy for you to let people into your personal space. It was no problem at all, Victoria, Edward replied. The boys need to get used to having new people around. Victoria laughed, a clear, musical sound. They're adorable, and they obviously need a mother figure in their lives. Ruby felt as if cold water had been poured over her. Let's take it slow, said Edward. But yes, I think it's time to move forward. I'll be here when you're ready. Victoria touched his face gently. Sarah would want you to be happy again. Ruby gasped. That woman knew Sarah. She was probably a family friend, someone Edward had known for years, someone who belonged to his world in a way Ruby never would. She waited until Victoria got into a silver BMW and left the property before moving. By the time she reached the back door, her legs were shaking and she felt like she might be sick. Ruby. Ollie ran to hug her as she came in. You're here? Daddy was talking with Aunt Victoria. Aunt Victoria? Ruby forced a smile. She was Mommy's friend, Liam explained. She's really pretty and smells like flowers. That's nice, Ruby managed to say, though her own voice sounded strange even to her. Edward came into the kitchen at that moment, looking different. Lighter, maybe, like someone who had made an important decision. Ruby, you're here. How was the traffic? Normal, she answered, avoiding his eyes. I'll start cleaning upstairs. She left the kitchen quickly, before he could notice that something was wrong. For the rest of the day, Ruby worked on autopilot. She cleaned, organized, played with the boys when needed, but her mind was elsewhere. Of course, Edward was moving on. Of course, he had found someone suitable for his social standing. Someone who could be the right kind of mother for his children, the right kind of wife for a millionaire CEO. Ruby had been foolish to think she could ever be more than the employee who had temporarily helped the family recover from grief. Ruby, are you okay? Liam asked during snack time. You look sad. I'm fine, sweetheart, she lied, forcing another smile. Just a little tired. Do you want to lie down with us and listen to stories? Ollie offered. Sometimes that helps when we're sad. Ruby's heart broke a little more. Those boys loved her, and she would have to leave their lives once Edward remarried. Maybe later, she said. Right now I need to finish my work. Edward noticed the change right away. Ruby was distant, formal, efficient but cold. She no longer hummed while she worked, didn't make up spontaneous games with the boys, didn't smile in that way that used to brighten the whole house. On Thursday, he found her quietly cleaning the library. Ruby, did something happen? You seem different. I'm fine, Mr. Royce, she replied, going back to the formal tone she hadn't used in weeks. Mr. Royce? He frowned. I thought we had moved past that. I'm sorry. That was a professional slip. Edward studied her for a moment. Something was wrong, very wrong, but he couldn't figure out what. Ruby, if I did something. You didn't do anything, she cut him off. I'm just reminding myself what my place here is. And with those words, she left the library, leaving Edward completely confused and with a sinking feeling that he had lost something important without even knowing what it was. That night, Ruby called her mother again. Mom, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. I think I need to look for another job. Why, Mija? What happened? I was right from the start. I was being foolish getting attached. He's already moving on, with someone who fits his life. Ruby, no, Mom. It was good while it lasted, but it's time to get back to reality. And for the first time since arriving at the Royce house, Ruby cried, because sometimes reality hurts more than any dream left unfulfilled. Friday morning came with a classic Chicago storm. Ruby arrived at the Royce mansion soaked, even though she had run from the bus stop to the door. Her mood was as heavy as the gray sky. She had spent the whole night rehearsing her resignation speech. It would be professional, polite, and brief. She wouldn't mention Victoria, she wouldn't talk about confusing feelings, she would simply say she had found a better opportunity somewhere else. Edward was in the kitchen when she walked in, making breakfast for the twins, something he rarely did before Ruby came into their lives. Good morning, he said, turning with a smile that faded the moment he saw her face. Ruby, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. We need to talk, she said formally, when the boys aren't around. Edward's stomach dropped. Her tone, the distance, the formality, all of it pointed to trouble. Of course. How about after lunch? The boys will be down for a nap. Ruby nodded and left the kitchen without another word. The day dragged on painfully slow. Edward couldn't focus on anything, worried about what Ruby wanted to say. She, on the other hand, worked with mechanical efficiency, barely interacting with the twins and avoiding all eye contact with him. At 2 o'clock, after putting Ollie and Liam down for their nap, Ruby met Edward in his office. Mr. Royce, I came to let you know I'll be leaving my job here. The words hit like a shot, direct and devastating. Edward jumped from his chair so quickly he knocked over a glass of water. What? Why? I found a better opportunity, she lied, fixing her gaze on a spot on the wall behind him. What opportunity? Ruby, if it's a matter of salary, it's not about money. Then what is it? Edward came around the desk, moving closer to her. Ruby, look at me. She finally looked, and in her eyes he saw something that told him everything. Pain, disappointment, resignation. Something happened, he said. You've been different since Wednesday. What did I do? You didn't do anything wrong. Ruby sighed. It's just, this is for the best. Best for who? For me? For the boys? They'll be devastated. They'll adjust. Children are resilient. And what about me? The question came out more vulnerable than he intended. Ruby closed her eyes for a moment. You'll adjust too, especially when you move on with your life. Edward frowned. Move on with my life? What are you talking about? About Victoria, Ruby said, finally looking straight at him. I saw you two talking on Wednesday. She's perfect for you. For the boys. Edward's face went through several expressions, confusion, realization, and then something that looked like relief. Ruby, he said, starting to smile. Victoria is the decorator I hired to plan the twins' birthday party. Ruby blinked. What? She's married, has 3 children, and has been friends with Sarah since college. I brought her in because she needs to know the boys well to plan a party they'll really enjoy. But I heard, Ruby stammered. She said something about the boys needing a mother figure? Because she was suggesting I hire a full-time nanny. Edward laughed. Ruby, did you really think I was? Reality hit Ruby like a truck. She had completely misunderstood the situation. Oh my God, I'm such an idiot, she muttered, covering her face with her hands. No, you're not, Edward said gently. You're jealous. Ruby pulled her hands away, blushing. I wasn't jealous. Yes, you were. And you know what? Edward took a step closer. I'm glad. Why? Because it means you care about me as much as I care about you. The words hung in the air between them. Ruby opened her mouth but couldn't form a reply. Edward took a deep breath. Ruby, ever since you came here, everything has changed. My boys came back to life. I started smiling again. This house became a home. And he hesitated. I fell in love with you, Edward. She whispered. I know it's complicated. I know we started as boss and employee, but I can't pretend anymore that it's only that. Ruby felt tears in her eyes. I fell in love with you too, she admitted. And with the boys, with this crazy family you let me be part of. Edward smiled, a bright smile she hadn't seen in days. Then why do you want to leave? Because I'm afraid, she said honestly. Afraid I won't be enough. That I don't belong in your world. Ruby, you don't belong in my world. Edward said, confusing her for a moment. You created a new world for us, a better one. He was about to say more when a clap of thunder shook the house, followed by the roar of heavy rain. The storm's getting worse, Ruby noted, looking out the window. How are you going to get home in this? Edward asked, worried. I'll wait until it eases up a little. But the rain showed no sign of stopping. On the contrary, the wind started howling, bending the trees in the garden. An hour later, when the twins woke up from their nap, the storm was still raging. Ruby can't go out in this rain, Ollie declared, staring out the living room window. She can sleep here, Liam suggested. In the guest room, Edward and Ruby exchanged a look. That's not a bad idea, he said. The forecast says the storm will last all night. Ruby hesitated. Staying in the house, especially after their conversation, felt dangerous. But outside, the wind was already tearing branches from the trees. All right, she agreed. But I need to stop by my apartment to get a few things. I'll take you, Edward offered. That's not necessary, Ruby, I'm not letting you go out alone in this storm. Half an hour later, they were running from the garage to Edward's car, completely soaked in the few steps it took. This is crazy, Ruby shouted over the roar of the wind. Absolutely, Edward agreed, laughing as he struggled to open the car door. The drive to Ruby's apartment was an adventure. Edward drove slowly, with almost no visibility because of the rain. They talked about trivial things, both avoiding the subject of the love confession that had happened earlier. At Ruby's apartment, while she packed clothes for the night, Edward looked around the small place. It was cozy, full of bright colors and family photos. Very different from the formal coldness of his mansion. Ready, Ruby said, coming out of the bedroom with a small bag. Ruby, Edward said, standing in front of a photo of her with an elderly woman. Is this your grandmother? It was. Grandma Carmen. She raised me after my father left. She looks like she was a special woman. She was. She always said true love doesn't choose by social class, skin color, or bank account. It chooses by heart. Edward turned to her. She was right. The drive back was even more dramatic. The wind had picked up, and when they got out of the car in the mansion's garage, a gust tore the umbrella out of Edward's hands, flipping it inside out. They ran toward the door, but Ruby slipped on the wet grass. Edward caught her, but lost his balance too. The two of them fell onto the lawn, soaked and covered in mud. "We look ridiculous," Ruby laughed, wiping dirt from her face. "Completely," Edward agreed. They stood up, still laughing, and ran to the porch. When they were finally safe under the roof, Edward looked at Ruby. She was soaked from head to toe, her hair plastered to her face, with dirt stains on her clothes. And she had never looked more beautiful. "Ruby," he said, suddenly serious, "I don't know what you are. I don't know if it's destiny, luck, or a miracle. But without you, this house is just a house again. My kids are just sad children again. And I go back to being just an empty man." Ruby looked at him, his words echoing in her heart. "Then it's time for you to learn how to clean up this emotional mess you call a heart," she said, taking a step toward him. And then, without any more hesitation, she kissed him. The kiss was everything neither of them expected, and everything they both needed. It was gentle and urgent, shy and passionate, a promise and an answer at the same time. When they pulled apart, both were breathless. "Does this mean you're not leaving?" Edward asked, leaning his forehead against hers. "It means I've found my place in the world," Ruby answered. "And it's here, with you." 2 weeks after the kiss and the storm came the big day. Ollie and Liam's 7th birthday. Ruby had spent the last weeks working with Victoria to turn the Royce Garden into a real amusement park. "Attention team!" Ruby shouted into the megaphone borrowed from Margaret, who had suggested it after seeing Ruby fail to make herself heard while trying to coordinate 5 different vendors. "The clowns arrive in 15 minutes. I want all the balloons in place now." Edward watched from a distance, laughing at how seriously Ruby took every detail of the party. She was wearing a yellow t-shirt with the words "Director of Fun" that the twins had decorated just for her. "Ruby looks like a general commanding her troops," commented Diana, who had come early to help. "A very cute general." Edward agreed, unable to take his eyes off his girlfriend. Yes, girlfriend. The word still sounded strange but wonderful. "Edward Royce." Ruby's voice echoed through the megaphone. "I need you here now." "At your service, General," he shouted back, running toward her. Ruby was standing next to a table that looked like a sugar-covered battlefield. There were pieces of cake everywhere, frosting on the tent walls, and an upside-down Spider-Man figure hanging from a palm tree. "What happened here?" Edward asked, trying not to laugh. "The twins wanted to help decorate the cake," Ruby explained, pointing to Ollie and Liam, who were covered in blue frosting from head to toe, "and I made the mistake of giving them creative freedom." "Surprise!" the 2 boys shouted, stretching out their arms to show off their sugary masterpiece. The original cake, which was supposed to look like an elegant castle, now looked more like a colorful explosion. There was frosting in every color imaginable, candy stuck to the sides, and what seemed to be a whole family of action figures emerging from the top. "It's unique," Edward said diplomatically. "It's terrible," Ruby laughed. "But they're so proud that I can't bring myself to redo it." "Then don't. It's perfect the way it is." At 3 in the afternoon, the garden was full of children running in every direction. The bounce house had turned into a friendly war zone. The face-painting table had a line of 15 kids, and the clowns were doing magic tricks that impressed the adults even more than the children. Ruby was everywhere at once, breaking up fights over balloons, cleaning scraped knees, serving slices of the explosion cake, and making sure every child was having fun. "She's amazing," Diana said to Edward, who was watching Ruby teach a group of children how to make giant soap bubbles. She agreed, with that goofy smile Diana hadn't seen on her brother's face in years. The most chaotic moment came during the water war Ruby had organized. What was supposed to be a controlled activity with water guns quickly turned into an epic battle involving hoses, buckets, and even the garden sprinkler system. Edward, who had at first tried to stay dry watching from afar, was pulled into the chaos when Liam shouted, "Dad, You're on Ruby's team." Before he could defend himself, he was bombarded by 10 kids armed with water guns. Within seconds, the Millionaire's CEO was drenched, running across the garden like a child, trying to get revenge on an army of little water warriors. "Get him!" Ollie shouted, pointing at his father. "Traitor!" Edward laughed, diving behind a tree to shield himself from the coordinated attack. Ruby watched the scene with her heart overflowing. Edward had traded his suit for shorts and a t-shirt. Cy was completely soaked, his hair a mess, and he looked like a 10-year-old boy again. "Ruby," one of the mothers called. "The cake is falling." She ran to the cake table and saw that the twins' unstable masterpiece was slowly tilting to one side. Without thinking twice, Ruby threw herself forward to hold it up with her own hands. "Someone help me here," she shouted, holding on to the icing castle that was about to collapse completely. Edward came running, still dripping from the water fight. "What do I do?" "Hold it here." Ruby nodded toward the spot he needed to support. The two of them stood there, united in a desperate mission to save the disaster cake, when Edward looked at her and started to laugh. "What are you laughing at?" Ruby asked, trying to keep a straight face. "At us. Look at this. I'm a millionaire CEO trying to save a cake that looks like it was hit by a hurricane. You're an amazing woman who turned my house into a circus. And here we are, covered in frosting and water, surrounded by 30 screaming kids." He paused. "And I've never been happier in my life." Ruby's heart skipped a beat. "Edward, Ruby," he said, ignoring the fact that they were still holding up a collapsing cake. "After this, you're not running away anymore. Will you officially be my girlfriend and the boy's mom?" Time stopped. The kids kept screaming in the background. The cake kept threatening to fall, but for Ruby and Edward, the world had shrunk to that one moment. "Are you sure this is what you want?" she asked, searching his eyes for any trace of hesitation. "If it's not you, it doesn't make sense," Edward replied, with a certainty that melted her. "Kiss, kiss," shouted Ollie and Liam, who had come closer and figured out what was happening. Soon all the children at the party joined in. "Kiss, kiss, kiss." Ruby looked around at the eager faces, then back at Edward. "Well," she said with a smile, "the audience has spoken." And there, in the middle of the messy garden, holding up a cake that defied every law of physics, Ruby and Edward kissed, while 30 children clapped and cheered with joy. A week after the twins' legendary birthday, Edward was in his office trying to focus on quarterly reports when laughter echoed down the hallway. He saved his document, closed the laptop, and went to investigate. Ruby was in the main room teaching Ollie and Liam how to dance salsa, using a broom as an improvised partner. "Now you spin like this," she demonstrated, twirling the broom as if it were a graceful partner. 1, 2, 3, turn. The boys tried to copy her, tripping over their own feet and collapsing into each other in a pile of laughter. "Dad," Liam shouted when he saw him, "Ruby's teaching us to dance for when we grow up and want to date." "Long-term strategy," Ruby explained with mock seriousness. "Men who can dance are irresistible." Edward laughed, watching the scene. In recent days, he had noticed how the house completely transformed whenever Ruby was there. It was as if she carried sunlight with her into every corner. He said, interrupting the dance lesson. "Can I talk to you?" "Of course. Boys, keep practicing. I want to see perfect spins when I get back." They went to the office, and Edward closed the door behind them. "Sit down," he said, pointing to the chair across from his desk. Ruby obeyed, suddenly nervous. "Did I do something wrong? Are the cleaning reports late? I can explain the ink stain on the living room carpet. It was totally an accident when—" Ruby. Edward cut her off, smiling. "You didn't do anything wrong." "Oh, then?" Edward took a deep breath. "I want you to move in here, officially." Ruby blinked several times. "What do you mean, officially?" "As part of the family. As my girlfriend. As the person who turned this house into a real home." The words tumbled out of her in a rush. "But Edward, I don't know if that's a good idea. It's too fast, and your neighbors will talk, and the boys might get confused about my role here." And Edward stood, walked around the desk, and knelt in front of her. "Ruby, look at me." She stopped talking and met his eyes. "I love you. The boys love you. You already are part of this family in every way that matters. The only thing missing is for you to bring your things here and make it official." Ruby felt her eyes fill with tears. "Are you sure?" I'm sure I can't imagine a single day without you here. And what if it doesn't work out? It's going to work, he said with conviction, because we already work. Ruby looked around the office, then back at Edward. All right, she said softly. I accept. Yes. Ollie and Liam shouted in unison from the other side of the door. Edward frowned. You were listening? The door opened and the twins rushed in. Sorry, Dad, but we wanted to know if Ruby was going to live with us forever, Ollie explained. And now she will. Liam cheered, jumping for joy. Ruby hugged them, one child in each arm. Are you sure you want a crazy housekeeper living in your home? We want you living in our home, Ollie corrected. Ruby who sings, who dances, who makes food fly, and who makes Dad smile. Exactly. Liam agreed. Ruby who belongs with us. Edward watched the scene, his heart overflowing. 3 days later, Ruby officially moved into the Royce mansion. She didn't have much, a few clothes, some books, a photo of her grandmother Carmen, and an impressive collection of cleaning products she insisted on bringing, because the ones you have are no good at all. Margaret had prepared the main guest room for her, but Ruby ended up spending most of her time in the twins' room, telling stories until they fell asleep, or in the living room with Edward, watching old movies and eating popcorn. Life in the house completely changed. Edward, who had always been punctual and methodical, began arriving late to the office for the first time in his career. His employees grew concerned until they discovered the reason was that he preferred staying home to have breakfast with his family. Mr. Royce, his secretary said one morning, you have a meeting with the investors in 10 minutes. Cancel it, Edward replied distractedly, reading a message from Ruby on his phone. Ruby wants to have a picnic in the garden. But, sir, these are the main investors. Margaret. Edward smiled. I spent 2 years living only for work. Now I have better reasons to live. That afternoon, the 4 of them were stretched out on a blanket in the garden. Edward had asked Margaret to prepare sandwiches, fruit, and lemonade for the impromptu picnic. Look, Liam said, pointing to a cloud. It looks like a dragon eating ice cream. Where? Ruby followed his finger. Oh, I see it. And that one looks like a ballerina. That one looks like Dad's face when he's mad. Ollie observed, pointing to a dark, heavy cloud. Hey! Edward protested, tossing a grape at his son. Ruby stood up, grabbed a dish towel they had used to wrap the sandwiches, and placed it on her head like a veil. I am Princess Ruby of the Kingdom of Dish Towels, she declared in a pompous voice. And I decree that in this kingdom, everyone must laugh at least 15 times a day. The twins burst into laughter. Princess Ruby, Ollie said, making an exaggerated bow. What does the princess wish for lunch? I wish for magical sandwiches and enchanted lemonade, she answered, keeping the royal tone. Edward watched the scene, shaking his head but smiling. You're crazy, he said, his voice filled with affection. Ruby pulled the towel off her head and threw it at him. And you're a former refrigerator in love, she teased, laughing. Former refrigerator? Liam asked, confused. Yes, Ruby explained. Your dad used to be cold and serious like a refrigerator, but now he melted and turned into sweet ice cream. The twins shouted. Dad turned into ice cream. What flavor am I? Edward asked, joining the game. Vanilla, Ollie shouted. Because you're so pale. I think he's chocolate. Liam disagreed. Because chocolate is the best flavor in the world, and Dad is the best dad in the world. Edward felt his eyes fill with tears. He picked Liam up and gave him a tight hug. And you are the best sons in the universe. Ruby looked at the family that had become her own, her heart full of a happiness she never thought possible. Group hug, she declared, joining the pile of arms and laughter. As the sun set over the Royce mansion garden, 4 people hugged on a picnic blanket, surrounded by sandwich crumbs, empty lemonade cups, and the sound of genuine laughter. And for the first time in a long time, the house wasn't just a place where they lived. It was a home where they were happy. What did you think of Ruby and Edward's story? Share your thoughts in the comments. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? Subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell to follow all our stories. And don't forget to check out more touching stories by clicking here on the final screen.